Yes, there has been a massive and coordinated effort to steal this election from we, the people of the United States of America, to delegitimize and destroy votes for Donald Trump, to manufacture votes for Joe Biden. They have done it in every way imaginable, from having dead people vote in massive numbers to absolutely fraudulently creating ballots that exist only voting for Biden. We've identified at least 450,000 ballots in the key states that miraculously only have a mark for Joe Biden on them and no other candidate. If you look at Florida, where things were done right, you can see that that's how the rest of the country should have gone. But they also used an algorithm to calculate the votes they would need to flip, and they used the computers to flip those votes from from Trump to Biden, and from other Republican candidates to their competitors also.
So there are recounts going on right now. We know that in Georgia, you have a list of numbers of ballots with only Joe Biden on the ticket. You say it's 98,000 ballots in Pennsylvania, 80 to 90,000 in Georgia, another 42,000 in Arizona, 69 to 115,000 in Michigan, and 62,000 in Wisconsin. Sydney, if this is true, this appears systemic. Where is the Department of Justice? Where is the AG Bill Barr? If this is so obvious, then why aren't we seeing massive government investigations?
I don't know. We definitely should be. I mean, we're getting reports of all kinds of fraud. We've got getting an affidavit from a postal worker now who talks about having been ordered to backdate ballots. No ballots received after the polls closed on voting day should even be counted. We've got multiple states that didn't even follow the rules of their own legislature. That's a federal constitutional issue.
We talked about the Dominion software. I know that there were voting irregularities. Tell me about that.
That's to put it mildly. The computer glitches could not and should not have happened at all. That is where the fraud took place, where they were flipping votes in the computer system or adding votes that did not exist. We need an audit of all of the computer systems that played any role in this fraud whatsoever. And, you know, Joe Biden had it right. He said that he had the biggest voter fraud organization ever, and he didn't need people's votes now. He would need people later. They had this all planned, Maria. They had the algorithms. They had the paper ballots waiting to be inserted if and when needed. And notably, President Trump's vote in the blue states went up enormously. That's when they had to stop the vote count and go in and replace votes for Biden and take away Trump votes.
I've never seen voting machines stop in the middle of an election, stop down and assess the situation. I also see reports that Nancy Pelosi's longtime chief of staff is a key executive at that company. Richard Blum, Senator Feinstein's husband, significant shareholder of the company. What can you tell us about the interest on the other side of this Dominion software?
Well, obviously, they have invested in it for their own reasons and are using it to commit this fraud to steal votes. I think they've even stolen them from other Democrats in their own party who should be outraged about this also. Bernie Sanders might very well have been the Democratic candidate, but they've stolen against whoever they wanted to steal it from.
If all this wasn't enough, in Antrim County, ballots were counted for Democrats that were meant for Republicans, causing a 6,000 vote swing against our candidates. The county clerk came forward and said tabulating software glitched and caused a miscalculation of the votes. Since then, we have now discovered that 47 counties use this same software in the same capacity. Antrim County had to hand count all of the ballots, and these counties that use this software need to closely examine their results for similar discrepancies.
Right here in Michigan, just last night in Oakland County, we found 2,000 ballots that had been given to Democrats that were Republican ballots due to a clerical error, and this took place in Rochester Hills. In Wayne County, Republican poll watchers were denied their legal right to monitor the election and purposely kept in the dark, both literally and figuratively, with poll workers blocking windows and padlocking doors. There are hundreds of reports of our poll watchers being intimidated and unable to do their job. There was a major software issue in Antrim County that we have concerns could have caused problems in other counties as well. This issue was brought to our attention by Congressman Bergman's office when they noticed the results being drastically different from what they expected and what they have received from that county in past elections. When they inquired with the clerk, they were told it was a software issue and it was corrected. But now we know that 47 counties use that same software. At the TCF Center in Wayne County, we have received over 100 incident reports of irregularities. This is a massive mail ballot counting center, and we need time to go through these reports and investigate them. Here's an example of just one of them. On November 3rd and 4th, a whistleblower was assigned to work on problem ballots in the TCF Center Adjudication Center. This is not a Republican poll worker. This is an actual election worker. A bundle of ballots with no receive date were brought to the whistleblower. The ballots should not have been immediately counted because there was no evidence. The ballots were received by the state mandated deadline of November 3rd. On the morning of November 4th, whistleblower was instructed by their supervisor to take the ballots with no dates, enter them into the electronic record, and place either November 2nd or November 3rd as the date received. This is illegal. This whistleblower was uncomfortable entering the dates on the ballots with no evidence. They were received on either of those dates. Election workers became angry at the whistleblower and blocked this individual from the process. According to the whistleblower, all election workers were given this same guidance. Reportedly, one of the individuals was a contractor, a city contractor, and former director of elections, Chris Thomas. We have heard other instances of election workers verbally accosting our poll watchers and refusing to let us challenge questionable ballots. Election workers were wearing Biden shirts and applauding when our poll watchers were removed from the counting facility. Of the few ballots that Democrat election workers did allow us to challenge, our observers say those ballots were then moved back into the regular pile after our poll watchers were intimidated and pushed from the process. This is our democracy. Yeah. To see people not be able to observe in Democrat-run cities across the nation is not okay.
For example, in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Michigan, the Trump campaign has now collected signed affidavits that attest to criminal activity during the voting process. In the city of Detroit, witnesses have alleged under oath that ballots were improperly backdated and counted without matching signatures. One poll watcher alleges that 40,000 late unsealed absentee ballots were counted orally, and all of them went for Democrats. In the state of Nevada, 8 whistleblowers from within the Nevada Election Department say they witnessed voter fraud abetted by other election officials and by their supervisors. According to one affidavit, a poll worker saw people bringing handfuls of ballots to a Biden-Harris campaign van. Those ballots were then filled out at the van, placed in return envelopes. Eventually, Biden supporters formed a wall to block outsiders from seeing what they were doing. Meanwhile, according to voting records, people who were not even alive still somehow managed to vote on Tuesday. In New York, deceased voters cast absentee ballots. On October 9th in Nevada, a man called Fred Stokes Jr. mailed in his vote. The only problem was Fred Stokes Jr. died 3 years ago at the age of 92. The Republican Party of Nevada says it is aware of hundreds of other potential cases of dead people casting ballots. In Pennsylvania, records show turnout from several people who were born in the 19th century. They apparently rose from their graves to vote. Now, all of that is real. We spent all weekend checking it. False claims of fraud can be every bit as destructive as the fraud itself, so we need to be careful and responsible, all of us. But what we just told you is true, and there's more of it. If you want people to believe that our system is real, that our system is worth, say, joining the military and dying to protect, then you've got to get to the bottom of what just happened, and you've got to do it as quickly and responsibly as you can. You can't have fraud in an election because no one will believe in elections, and then things fall apart. But gathering facts is the last thing our media, our designated fact gatherers, seem to want to do. Instead, they're demanding that you shut up and accept Joe Biden. Period. That's their verdict. You must accept it. And if you don't accept it, they'll hurt you. The point isn't that we need to keep investigating until Donald Trump wins. That is not the point. The point is we need to find out what happened so that the rest of us believe the system is real. And to make that happen, Congress ought to investigate every meaningful claim of illegal voting. Every legitimate claim that is raised must be investigated. One of the first things that we should be honest about is that the worst forms of election tampering took place far from polling sites. It wasn't votes from dead people. Those are bad. But they weren't the worst thing. The worst thing was more obvious than that. The worst thing was Silicon Valley. The tech monopolies spent the final weeks of the presidential election suppressing the voices of Trump supporters and hiding damaging information about his opponent, Joe Biden. That happened. We saw it firsthand. We experienced it. You may have too. In August, Facebook banned the pro-Trump Super PAC Committee to Defend the President from buying any campaign advertising. What? What election has that happened in? None. Just a few weeks ago, as you well know, the New York Post published true and accurate details of the Biden family's lucrative overseas influence peddling operation, which was real, which Joe Biden knew about. Facebook, in turn, limited the distribution of this article, and Twitter blocked people from posting. In other words, they censored it. They kept people from knowing about it. And on what basis? Nothing in those articles was untrue, but they censored it anyway, along with any content that was critical of lockdowns and mandatory mask wearing. Why? Because Biden supported those. If voters aren't allowed to learn critical facts about political candidates before they vote, you can't have a democracy. And of course, that's why they're doing it.
Well, I would say that it's a very, very powerful lawsuit. It demonstrates already that approximately 600,000 ballots were cast without any observation by Republicans, meaning mail-in ballots. So Pennsylvania elections are governed by the legislature, not the governor, not even the Congress. So the state legislature provided, when these mail-in ballots were allowed, right, that they would have to be observed by a Republican and a Democrat. And if not, it would be an unlawful ballot. Well, there are somewheres north of 600,000 unlawful ballots cast in this election.
Rudy, let me turn to Nevada. The president tweeting about a huge number, calling it a cesspool of illegal votes. Your judgment on Nevada, on Arizona tonight, and then I want to turn to Georgia after you just.
Well, I can tell you as a group, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states in which the same exact pattern took place. That is so unusual that it cannot be coincidental. On the morning of the election, when the mail-in ballots were being looked at and counted, the Republican inspectors were not allowed to get near the ballots. They were put in corrals, right, 20 to 30 feet away. Amazing. And while the counting went on, they could see nothing but white envelopes being passed back and forth. In other words, they couldn't see the writing on the envelope that would verify the ballot. And then the envelope was thrown away. At that point, the law is violated because the law requires that there be observation by both sides. That's the only way we can protect these mail ballots from fraud. Well, think about it, Lou. It means on Election Day, the chief Democratic crook in Philly wakes up and has the same idea as the one in Pittsburgh, the one in Detroit, the one in Milwaukee, same idea as the one in Nevada, Georgia, in Reno, in Phoenix, Arizona, and Atlanta, Georgia. They all do the same thing. They all put the Republicans in corrals. I mean, they must have at least subcontracted for the corrals. So we're going to take discovery. I think this was a common plan. In any event, I mean, the vote in Pennsylvania has to be altered to throw out these illegal ballots. So that's going to overturn. I mean, he was ahead. But in fact, the funny thing is, we have 682 illegal ballots. Remember on election night, he was ahead by 740,000 votes?
Right.
Sounds like this is exactly the plan they had to overcome the 700,000 votes.
Also, the voting machines and the irregularities, the anomalies, as some want to call it. But again, they share, in many cases, the same electronic voting companies providing the software and the machines. and the same irregularities. It's what is your judgment on that as we close out here?
My judgment is that when Hillary Clinton said to Biden about 4 weeks ago, "Don't concede no matter what," she meant even if you're behind by 800,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Joe, don't worry, we'll fix it for you. I mean, that's an extraordinary number to make up, Lou. 800. I never saw that 800,000 vote margin made up. And when you consider the fact they wouldn't let us look at a single ballot. So now, why, if these ballots are legitimate, would you not let us look at it and remove this issue? Why do you want to give us this issue all over the country if it's not critical? I mean, and these are all the states I'm mentioning. These are all the states in which he had to catch up, right? Except maybe for Arizona.
So we've got to have a massive legal operation. I know the Biden campaign is working on that. We have to have poll workers, and I urge people who are able to be a poll worker. We have to have our own teams of people to counter the force of intimidation that the Republicans and Trump are going to put outside polling places. This is a big organizational challenge, but at least we know more about what they're going to do. And, you know, Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances, because I think this is going to drag out, and eventually I do believe he will win if we don't give an inch.
And it is something, like I said, it is something out of the third world. I'm going to read a little bit for you here. It says at approximately 4 a.m. on November 4, 2020, tens of thousands of ballots were suddenly brought into the counting room through the back door. Exhibit C, affidavit of Andrew Sito. So he's showing pictures as they're going through this. These new ballots were brought to the TCF Center by vehicles with out-of-state license plates. Quote, it was observed that all these new ballots were cast for Joe Biden, every single one of them. Despite election rules that require that all absentee ballots be inputted into the QVF system, the qualified voter system, before 9 p.m. on November 3rd, 2020, the election workers inputted all of these new ballots into the QVF and manually added each voter to the list at 9 p.m. Upon information and belief, the vast majority of these new ballots indicated the voters' date of birth as January 1st, 1900, entered into the QVF system. We've seen this before. We're going to get to that next. These newly received ballots were either fraudulent or apparently cast by persons who were not registered to vote prior to the polls closing at 8 p.m. We have more. The sworn affidavit states that the vast majority of these ballots were from people that were born on January 1st, 1900. This would make the voters almost 121 years old. Now, an alleged picture of these names in the system was taken by an observer who was later kicked out for photography, and I'm guessing that this is probably one of the pieces of evidence mentioned in that affidavit there. Now, another part of the statement claims election workers assigned ballots to random names already in the qualified voter file to people who haven't voted in the 2020 election. The sworn statement alleges that election workers systematically used false information in order to be able to process the absentee ballot, such as false birthdays. Now listen to the sworn affidavit here. This is according to this sworn affidavit. It says, defendants systematically processed and counted ballots from voters whose name failed to appear in either the qualified voter file or in the supplemental sheets. When a voter's name could not be found, the election worker assigned the ballot to a random name already in the QVF, to a person who had not voted. Defendants instructed election workers to not verify signatures on absentee ballots. Defendants instructed election workers to process ballots that appeared after the election deadline and to falsely report that those ballots had been received prior to November 3rd, 2020. Defendants systematically use false information to process ballots, such as using incorrect or false birthdays, many times. The election workers inserted new names into the QVF after the election and recorded these new voters as having a birth date of 1/1/1900. So now this is starting to make a lot more sense. And then we have this from David Schaefer, an official in Georgia. He says, quote, let me repeat. Fulton County election officials told the media and our observers that they were shutting down the tabulation center at State Farm Arena at 10:30 p.m. on election night. only to continue counting ballots in secret until 1 a.m. No one disputes that Fulton County election officials falsely announced that the counting of ballots would stop at 10:30 p.m. No one disputes that Fulton County elected officials unlawfully resumed the counting of ballots after our observers left the center. No one disputes this because this is what was happening in all of these swing states. We went to bed. Trump was up almost 1 million votes in Pennsylvania, hundreds of thousands in Michigan, hundreds of thousands in Georgia, 150,000 in Wisconsin. All the betting markets had him up like 80 cents for all of these states and for the entire election in general. And then they stopped the count. They said they were stopping it and they weren't going to resume until late afternoon, probably the next day, or they needed a couple of days. And then they counted ballots in secret, just like that sworn affidavit said in Detroit, where they trucked in a bunch of cars with license plates from out of states, brought in boxes upon boxes upon boxes of ballots, and then counted them in secret in the dead of night when everyone was sleeping. And also changed the names, used names of people who were already in the QVF, people who hadn't voted this election, changed their birth date, so that they can validate these ballots that they're processing in the dead of night without any poll watchers around to watch them. And you'll hear a lot of excuses coming from people. I just saw a video from Kyle Kalinske the other day who claimed that, well, we told you this was going to happen. You should not be shocked at what is happening right now. We told you the red mirage was real, that President Trump would appear to win on Election Day by big margins, but then once all the mail-in votes were counted, then Trump's lead would diminish and Joe Biden would take the lead. And why is this? Well, it's because all of the mail-in ballots heavily favor Democrats, and this is exactly the reason. Number one, that's not how they count ballots. You can actually plot this out. You can take the data from Edison Research, and you can plot exactly how they count the ballots. Number two, if we just look at the mail-in and early in-person ballots returned, Republicans led in Michigan, Republicans led in Wisconsin, Republicans led in Arizona, Republicans led in Georgia for mail-in ballots requested and mail-in and early in-person ballots returned, and this was on Election Day. These are screen caps from the NBC data on Election Day. Republicans led in this arena in all 4 of those particular states. The only exception is Pennsylvania.
Now, people will think, well, hang on a second, this can't be possible. Well, it can be. This happened in Britain in 2005, where they found a warehouse that was an electoral fraud factory. Because it turns out that people who are deeply invested in a particular cause, naturally this was for the Labour Party, it seems that for the right wing, the process is the thing that is important, and for the left wing, it is the outcome that is important. So to the right wing, cheating becomes immoral because you're disrespecting the process. But to the left wing, losing is immoral because you're failing to achieve the utopian goal that you have in mind. And so cheating becomes a moral good in order to achieve this greater goal that you are heading towards. Whereas for the conservative, for the right, cheating is obviously a moral evil, and an outcome that is attained by evil ends is in and of itself an evil outcome.
From the very beginning, the whole plan of the Democrat Party was to steal this election with mail-in ballots. Mm-hmm. It's the way they steal. Before that, they used to hold back one of the counties in the state, and then when they needed enough votes, they produced enough votes to win. That's how Mayor Daley won the 1960 election against John Kennedy.
Right.
So the mail-ins were right for this. We had no observer, not a single observer, for over 350,000 mail-in votes that were counted. When you have a mail-in vote, absentee votes are always counted this way. In order to verify the vote, there's a Republican on one side, a Democrat on the other side, and an election official on the other. He takes out the envelope. Everybody gets the chance to look at it. They make sure it's a real envelope. They open that up. They put it aside. Then there's an inner envelope. They make sure that that is properly processed to a specific election district. They look inside. They see a ballot. They don't look at who he votes for. And then they both approve it, and they put it in the voting pot. Either side can make an objection.
Right.
The Republican or the Democrat, and then they put those aside, and then those are examined by an independent judge. That did not happen here. The law required that it happen.
Wow.
The law required that every single ballot be observed, because these mail-in ballots are inherently prone to fraud. They're easy to send in 100 of them,
right?
200 of them,
right?
So this is a very important part of the process that removes the fraud.
Right.
In the case of 400 or so ballots, there was no Republican inspector. We have 50 different witnesses to establish that and videotape. Well, I think the whole mail-in system from the very beginning was designed to give Democrats their fail-safe. That's why I think Hillary said, don't concede no matter what the vote is. Keep going. Look, you look at Pennsylvania the night of the election. He was ahead by 800,000 votes.
Yeah, it was crazy.
64% of the vote. It's almost mathematically impossible to make that up, and we'll have experts that say that. So you got to cheat in order to make that up.
Right.
So I think that the mail-in vote was always kind of a way the Democrats could cloud what they do in almost every election, which is they hold back a couple of key cities.
Right.
To try to see how much they have to make up. Now, if they have to make up too much, they usually give up. But if they're within 1 or 2%, they're going to try to steal the election. In this case, it was too important.
Right.
So they went for a big one. The reason the situation in Pennsylvania is so obvious is they had to make up 800,000 votes.
Right.
I mean, they even expanded the denominator. At one point, there were 94% of the votes cast.
Right.
They counted 40,000 more votes, and it went down to 90%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's impossible.
Wow. Now, how does that happen?
That means you brought more. That means you ship more votes in the back door. Right.
Right. Yeah.